What a day in Karen Read's retrial. How much time do you have? 10 minutes or less. As we always do, here's a recap of what happened today. It's day 25 of testimony. It's Monday, June 2nd. Here's what you need to know. So the judge ruled first thing in the morning before the jury was in there that she would allow Michael Proctor's text messages to come in as evidence through his friend, meaning that Proctor would not have to testify in order for his text messages to become evidence. This is something that the defense wanted because the state didn't call Proctor. The defense didn't want to call Proctor because they'd be kind of backed into a corner with the style of questioning they could do. So instead, they're going to admit his text messages without him on the stand. Then, immediately after that, the jury comes in and the friend who will be the one through whom the texts are admitted testifies. That's Jonathan Diamandis. He's a lifelong friend of Michael Proctor. He's known him since middle school. David Yannetti direct examines him, so asks him questions. All the testimony is that he's a lifelong friend of Proctor, has stayed close after high school, that he was in a group chat of 9 people, I believe it was, who all grew up together or are all from Canton, and that this witness only sent one text in an entire snippet of the thread that was given to him. The entire conversation was over 38,000 text messages, but he was given a few pages of texts, and then that's it. He doesn't read the text. There's no further questions by Yannetti. Then on cross-examination, Hank Brennan says, "Are you still friends with Michael Proctor?" He says yes. And then Brennan says, "In that text thread, are there inappropriate comments your friend made about the investigation?" He says yes. Then a little while later, I'm trying to summarize, he asks the witness to read Proctor's text messages. And the witness says, and I quote, "These are not my words. I'm not really comfortable reading these. Do I have to say these words out loud?" The lawyers go to sidebar. They come back and Hank Brennan says, "I'll read them," meaning Hank Brennan is going to read Michael Proctor's text messages. So get this, prosecutor reading Michael Proctor's text messages on cross-examination of Michael Proctor's friend. He reads the text messages. You've heard them before. He reads whack job, C word, yeah, she's a babe, weird Fall River accent though, no. Anyway, a lot of the text messages are read by Hank Brennan, and then the witness says, yes, those are accurate. Then after that, Brennan asks if the witness is aware that his friend was fired from state police. He says, yes, I am aware. Are you aware why he was fired? He says, I don't know all of the details, but I do know that it was because of these text messages. And then one of his last questions, Brennan says, in your text messages with Mr. Proctor, did he ever discuss framing any defendant, including this one? And the witness says, absolutely not. Then back on redirect with David Yannetti, David Yannetti points out that the information in the text, including about Karen Read's medical conditions, was private information that Proctor was sharing with his high school buddies. And he also points out that Proctor was the only one revealing details about the case to the witness, and he says correct. Okay, then he's done. Then Kelly Dever is called to the stand. I think I told you about her on Friday. I didn't know who she was. Now we do. So Kelly Dever is a former Canton police officer and a current Boston police officer. So she's called to the stand. Alan Jackson is questioning her. And despite the testimony not factually maybe being any of the strongest evidence in this case, Kelly Dever on the stand was a very strange moment, perhaps the most tense testimony we have seen in either of these trials. So she takes the stand and she clearly is uncomfortable being there on the stand. She's asked about her career, and she talks a little bit about what she remembers about that night, but she keeps saying it's 3.5 years later, I don't remember much. Okay. Then she's asked why she's here, and she says, I don't know why I'm here. I have no connection to this case. Then she's asked what she had testified to in a prior interview. Okay, follow this. What she had answered in a prior interview with a different law enforcement agency. So it's a very vague question, and here's why. It's because nobody in this case is allowed to mention the federal investigation into the case. That's prohibited testimony. So she's asked this vague question. She's interviewed in August of 2023 by, we know, the feds. The jury doesn't know this, by some independent law enforcement agency. And she says to Alan Jackson, I cannot make the statement that you're wanting me to make on the stand because I've been advised that now that would be a lie. And Alan Jackson says, did you observe something in the Sallyport garage on January 29th that you found unusual that stuck out in your head? And she says, given factual information, that means I know I did not. The answer is no. And Alan Jackson says, when you did this interview with these officers in 2023, were you advised that lying to them would be a crime? And she says, I made that statement back then in good faith. And she says to Alan Jackson on the stand, you threatened to charge me with perjury if I did not lie on the stand right now. So It's immediately tense. It's kind of unclear what's going on. What ends up happening is that what Dever had told the FBI and the feds is that she saw on January 29, 2022, former Canton Police Chief Ken Berkowitz and Brian Higgins go into the Sally Port at Canton Police with Karen Reed's Lexus for what she called a wildly long time. Now, she has since recanted that statement because she says, well, we won't get there. We'll get there on cross. So she finishes talking about how she was called up to Commissioner Cox, the Boston Police Commissioner's office, when she was called to testify in this trial. And Alan Jackson's like, didn't you find it odd that Cox would call a rookie police officer up to his office? And she's like, no, it's a reflection of his good leadership. It was really tense. And it was so tense that at one point Alan Jackson asked for a sidebar. They go to sidebar, and when he comes back, he starts asking all leading questions, and there's no objection by prosecutors. And so the assumption there, we don't know for sure because it happened at sidebar, but the assumption was that he asked the judge to treat this witness as a hostile witness, which would give him the permission to ask leading questions, because there was an immediate flip of a switch as soon as he got back after that sidebar. Okay. Then cross-examination happens, and Kelly Dever says to Hank Brennan, the defense was essentially telling me what they were looking for me to say on the stand, looking for me to say that I saw Higgins and Berkowitz in the garage with the car. Then she says, when she told them she wouldn't say that because it's no longer true, they became very aggressive, raised their voices, and the one word I remember is they said they would charge me with perjury. And her explanation for why she recanted that statement is that she said she initially thought that, but that it was a bad memory because she was later presented with a timeline, which clearly showed in her testimony that she left work that day at 3:45 p.m. and that Karen Reed's car didn't show up to Canton Police until 5:30-ish p.m. So therefore, maybe she saw Berkowitz and Higgins go into the Sally Port, but she says she didn't see them go in with Karen Reed's car because she wasn't at Canton Police anymore when Karen Reed's car came to the station. Okay, so anyway, she talked about how there was the phone call turned hasty and uncomfortable with defense attorneys. Then back on redirect, things are tense all over again with Alan Jackson. She's clearly uncomfortable being there. And he points out, who can charge someone with perjury? And she doesn't really want to answer. And then ultimately she says, well, the DA's office can. He says, can a defense attorney charge someone with perjury? You're a police officer. You know this. She says, no. And then he said, nobody on this defense told you they could charge you with perjury, did they? And she says, oh, yes, they did. I contacted the FBI with it. Why does that matter? Because like I said, the feds have not been allowed to be mentioned in this trial. And then this woman says on the stand that she contacted the FBI and reported that in her experience, she says the defense told her she would be charged with perjury if she changed her statement, more or less, is what she was testifying to. And so things were very, very tense at this point, as I've said many times. Alan Jackson points out again, you never saw them leave, but you said Berkowitz and Higgins were in the Sally Port for a wildly long time together there. And she does say, yes, that's what I said at the time during that testimony. And at one point, he accidentally calls her Officer Dever instead of Dever. And she says back, just like you can't remember my name, I don't remember. Obviously, that's not an important piece of factual testimony, but it's a good example of how tense this cross-examination was, and direct examination. Sorry, not cross-examination, this direct examination. The defense called this witness not knowing how she was going to testify. She was subpoenaed to be there, and then it was extremely tense. I asked Karen Reed, as did other reporters, about this after court today, and she said she'd never talked to this woman. She didn't know how she was going to testify, and that she called her because they wanted her to testify to exactly what she had told the feds about 2 years ago. And obviously that's not what she testified to. She changed her statement. Karen Reed denied any allegation of telling this witness to lie on the stand. So that was the real tension of the day, which is why I'll give you a summary in 30 seconds or less of what happened next, because we'll talk about this more tomorrow. Then Dr. Marie Russell takes the stand. You know Dr. Russell from the first trial. She's a California emergency room doctor, long list of credentials, former Malden, Mass police officer, went to MIT, forensic pathology, etc., expert in dog bites. She testifies that in her opinion, the injuries to John O'Keefe's right arm are consistent with dog bites or a dog attack. Every time she says attack, that gets stricken from the records. She says dog bites or scratches. Ultimately, that's what she testifies to. Cross-examination with her began, but it did not finish. So Dr. Russell will be back on the stand first thing tomorrow, which is why this is a pretty brief description of her testimony. And that's all I have. See you tomorrow. Bye.